Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine, even when you're alone? Tonight, that feeling might have a story to tell. Hello, I'm the Mesmer. No matter where you are, or what time it is, I'm here to guide you into a realm where shadows whisper and mysteries unfold. Leave your worries behind. Let your mind wander and drift into the unknown. Here, where shadows dance and secrets lie in wait, allow your thoughts to drift into a dream of mystery. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and relax. If you enjoy this, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts. Let's begin. The wind howled through the empty fields, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The last traces of daylight faded behind thick, gray clouds, casting the landscape into an eerie twilight. As Daniel Cart steered his pickup truck down the narrow dirt road, his headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the overgrown grass and the skeletal remains of a once thriving cornfield. This place had been abandoned for years, yet something about it still felt alive. He had been searching for solitude, a place to escape the chaos of city life, a sanctuary where he could finally finish the novel he had been struggling with for months. When he found the listing for an old farmhouse at an unbelievably low price, it felt like fate. The photos showed a rustic, albeit slightly neglected, home with a sprawling front porch and acres of untouched land. It was exactly what he needed. The previous owner had left in a hurry, or so the real estate agent claimed, but Daniel didn't press for details. He didn't care about the past. He just wanted a quiet place to write. The house came into view as he rounded the final bend. It stood against the backdrop of an endless sky, its wooden exterior weathered and dull, as if the elements had tried to erase it from existence. The front porch sagged slightly, the paint peeling away in long, curling strips. But it was the figure standing near the porch that made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. A scarecrow. It leaned against the railing, slumped over as if exhausted from years of standing watch over empty fields. Its clothes, tattered overalls and a plaid shirt, hung loosely over a frame of rotting wood and straw. The wide-brimmed hat obscured most of its face, but from this distance, Daniel could see the rough stitches that formed its crude, stitched-up mouth. Something about it unsettled him, though he couldn't explain why. Shaking off the unease, he parked the truck and stepped out. The air was cool, carrying whispers of an approaching storm. Gravel crunched beneath his boots as he made his way to the porch. He avoided looking at the scarecrow, focusing instead on unlocking the door. The key turned with a reluctant click, and the heavy wooden door groaned open, revealing the dimly lit interior. Dust coated every surface, swirling in the weak glow of the porch light. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood and neglect. He stepped inside, setting his duffel bag on the floor. The furniture was covered with white sheets, their ghostly forms casting elongated shadows against the walls. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This was home now. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. He locked the door behind him, shaking off the lingering tension. He told himself it was just exhaustion from the long drive, the stress of moving. Yet, as he passed by the front window, he couldn't resist a glance outside. The scarecrow was still there, unmoving, watching. Daniel spent the rest of the evening unpacking, settling into the space that would be his refuge for the foreseeable future. He checked the power, the plumbing, both functional, though in desperate need of maintenance. He made a mental note to call someone about the flickering kitchen light. After heating a can of soup and eating in the dimly lit dining room, he decided to get some rest. The old house groaned as the wind battered its walls, but otherwise, the night was still. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the image of the scarecrow crept back into his thoughts. There was something oddly human about the way it slouched against the railing, as though it had been left there and forgotten. A ridiculous thought. He turned over, pulling the blankets tighter around himself. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the loose window panes. Just the wind, he assured himself. Just the house settling. Then came the creak, faint but deliberate, like the sound of a footstep on the porch. Daniel's body went rigid. He held his breath, listening. Silence followed, stretching out for what felt like eternity. His mind raced through rational explanations. A loose board, an animal, the wind shifting the old wood. Still, the unease coiled in his stomach like a serpent. Finally, he forced himself to sit up, rubbing the exhaustion from his eyes. He reached for the bedside lamp, but before he could switch it on, something outside caught his eye. The scarecrow. It was no longer slumped against the railing. It was standing upright, facing the house. Daniel's breath hitched. He blinked, convinced his tired mind was playing tricks on him. The dim light from the porch barely illuminated the figure, but he could swear the angle had changed. He could feel it looking at him. For several minutes, he sat frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he reached for his phone. No signal. Of course, the reception out here was unreliable at best. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Get a grip," he muttered. "It's just a scarecrow." Determined to prove himself right, he climbed out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and made his way downstairs. The wooden steps groaned under his weight, the sound swallowed by the howling wind. He hesitated at the front door, fingers hovering over the lock. A deep breath steadied his nerves before he turned the knob and stepped onto the porch. The night air was colder than before, carrying the sharp scent of rain. He lifted the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The scarecrow stood exactly where he had last seen it, stiff and silent. Daniel exhaled a shaky laugh. "You're losing it, man." He stepped closer, shining the light over the figure. The straw poking out from its sleeves was brittle and dry. The stitches on its face were frayed. Up close, it looked exactly as it should, a lifeless construct of fabric and straw. Yet, as he turned to go back inside, a gust of wind rustled through the fields. The scarecrow's arm twitched. Daniel froze. It was just the wind. It had to be. With a muttered curse, he hurried inside, locking the door behind him. He refused to look back out the window as he climbed the stairs. Back in his room, he shut the blinds, switched off the lamp, and buried himself under the covers. Sleep did not come easily. Outside, in the darkness, the scarecrow stood tall, watching, waiting. And just before dawn, when the wind had finally settled, its head turned ever so slightly toward the window where Daniel slept. The first light of dawn filtered through the dusty windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the wooden floor. Daniel sat up slowly, rubbing his temples. The unease of the previous night lingered in his chest like a bad dream. But in the brightness of morning, it all seemed less terrifying. Determined to shake off the paranoia, he stepped outside with a steaming cup of coffee. The crisp air carried the scent of damp earth, and the wind rustled through the overgrown fields. From the porch, he glanced toward the scarecrow. It stood in its usual place, its stitched grin still eerily lifeless. But something about it unsettled him. Had its arms shifted slightly, Was it always leaning at that angle? Shaking the thought away, Daniel turned his focus to the farmhouse itself. Years of abandonment had left their mark. Dust and cobwebs clung to the corners, and old furniture sat under tattered sheets, frozen in time. In the dining area, deep scratches marred the wooden table, claw-like, jagged, almost deliberate. An ancient grandfather clock stood against the hallway wall, its pendulum still, frozen at an odd time. 3:12. His search led him to the kitchen, where rusted appliances stood like relics of another era. The cabinets held delicate porcelain dishes, untouched for years. He hesitated before opening one drawer, where a single old photograph lay beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers. It showed the house as it once was, pristine, welcoming. But as his eyes scanned the image, his stomach dropped. In the background, barely noticeable, was the scarecrow, and it was standing much closer to the house than it should have been. A chill crawled up his spine, but he forced himself to press on. Outside, he ventured toward the dilapidated barn at the edge of the property. The structure leaned dangerously, its beams groaning in protest against the wind. Inside, hay lay scattered in thick piles, the scent of decay clinging to the walls. But what caught his attention was in the farthest corner, a second scarecrow, much older and deteriorated, half buried beneath rotting debris. Daniel frowned. Why were there two? And why had this one been discarded? Before he could think further, a gust of wind slammed the barn door shut. His pulse quickened as he spun around, scanning the dim interior. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. Still, the weight of unseen eyes pressed down on him. Deciding he had seen enough, he quickly made his way back to the farmhouse. As he approached, a sense of dread curled in his gut. The scarecrow in the field stood motionless, as always, yet it seemed different. Had it turned its head slightly? He swallowed, quickening his pace. It had to be a trick of the light, a coincidence. But deep down, something gnawed at him, whispering the truth he didn't want to acknowledge. Something wasn't right. That night, the house felt even quieter than before. The silence pressed against Daniel's ears, thick and unnatural. As he lay in bed, he found himself staring at the ceiling, waiting, though he didn't know for what. Then he heard it. A soft creak on the front porch, a slow, deliberate shift of weight against old wooden planks. His breath hitched. He strained his ears, waiting for another sound, another sign that he wasn't imagining things. But the silence stretched on, taut and unbroken. Morning came with an eerie stillness. Daniel stepped onto the porch, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and nearly dropped his coffee. A single dead bird lay at his feet. Its tiny body was stiff, wings twisted unnaturally, its glassy eyes reflecting the gray sky. The next morning, there were 3. By the end of the week, the pile had grown. 7, 8, more each day, their lifeless forms arranged with unsettling precision. A pattern, a message. His gaze flickered toward the field. The scarecrow stood as it always had, but Daniel's chest tightened at the sight. Was it leaning forward now? He shook his head, forcing out a nervous chuckle. Maybe the wind had shifted it. But then came the night he saw it move. He had stayed up late, sifting through the books and papers he'd found in the attic, searching for something, anything, that might explain the farmhouse's history. It was past midnight when he stretched and turned toward the window. His eyes landed on the scarecrow, and his blood turned to ice. It was closer. Not in the field, not by the fence, but halfway to the porch. His pulse thundered in his ears. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head. No, that wasn't possible. It had to be his imagination. Gripping the flashlight from his bedside table, he moved cautiously toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the figure. The scarecrow was still. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, but as he lowered the flashlight, a flicker of motion caught his eye. The head had tilted, just barely, a fraction of an inch. Daniel stumbled back, heart pounding. He yanked the curtains shut, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. He locked the doors, the windows, anything to create a barrier between himself and whatever was outside. But sleep never came. Every rustling leaf, every creak of the house sent his nerves into overdrive. And just before dawn, as exhaustion finally weighed down his eyelids, a sound echoed through the farmhouse. A knock. Not on the door, not on the walls. It came from the window. Daniel sat up sharply, his pulse a wild drumbeat in his chest. He didn't move, barely breathed. But then, a whisper. Software, almost teasing. "Let me in." His entire body locked in terror. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with something unseen. He could feel it watching him, pressing against the glass. The sun rose slowly that morning, its light creeping through the blinds. Daniel didn't dare move until the warmth reached him. When he finally gathered the courage to look outside, his stomach twisted into knots. The scarecrow was back in the field, but its head was turned directly toward his window. And in the dirt just beneath the glass, drawn in jagged lines of charcoal, was a single word: tonight. The farmhouse no longer felt like a home. It had become a cage, an endless loop of suffocating fear. Daniel tried everything to stay logical, to convince himself that there was a reasonable explanation. But with each passing hour, the sense of isolation grew stronger. He tried his truck again that morning. The engine refused to turn over, the battery seemingly drained overnight. He popped the hood, checked the cables, but everything looked intact. The tank had fuel. There was no reason for it not to start. He pulled out his phone. Still no signal. Stepping back toward the house, he caught a flicker of movement in the field. His stomach lurched. The scarecrow was gone. His pulse hammered in his ears as he scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the figure. Nothing. Only the swaying fields, whispering in the wind. It had been there last night. He was certain of it. That evening, the whispers returned. Faint at first, but then louder. A scratching against the walls. A sound like nails dragging across the wooden planks outside his window. He bolted upright, gripping the knife he kept by his bedside. Then came the knock. A single, deliberate knock at the front door. He moved slowly, every step a battle against his rising panic. He peered through the peephole. Nothing. Just the empty porch. Then the knock came again. This time, from the back door. Daniel spun around, his breath catching. It was impossible. He hadn't heard footsteps. No one could have moved that fast. His fingers trembled as he reached for the back door handle, pressing his ear against the wood. Silence. Then a whisper, right against the door. "Let me in." A choked gasp escaped him as he stumbled backward. His mind screamed at him to run, but where? The farmhouse was his prison. He was cut off from the outside world, trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. The lights flickered. A shadow moved across the living room, just beyond his vision. Daniel didn't dare move. He forced himself to focus, to listen. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the house. He wasn't alone anymore. And then, from the darkness, came a single, chilling sound. Laughter. A deep, guttural chuckle that didn't belong to any human being. Daniel clamped a hand over his mouth to keep from screaming. His body trembled as the air grew thick, heavy with something unseen. He could feel it watching him, lurking just beyond the flickering light. Then, a whisper, soft and teasing, right behind his ear. "You can't leave." The darkness swallowed the room, and Daniel knew he was no longer alone. Daniel had been running on pure instinct, but there was nowhere left to go. The farmhouse that had once been his retreat had now become his prison, its walls pulsing with a presence that seemed to be watching, waiting. He had locked every door, every window, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough. It was never enough. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It felt deliberate, calculated, like the calm before a storm. He paced the living room, axe in one hand, flashlight in the other, his heart pounding like a drum. The shadows in the corners of the house had deepened, thickening, like ink bleeding into paper. Then, a voice, software childlike. Daniel. His breath hitched. The sound had come from the hallway leading to the basement. Daniel turned slowly, gripping the axe tighter. His mind screamed at him to run, to leave this house behind. But his body moved forward instead, drawn by something he couldn't explain. He stepped into the dark hallway, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The basement door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. Another whisper. Closer this time. "Come see." Daniel swallowed hard and reached for the door. The wood was ice cold beneath his palm. He pushed it open slowly, revealing the narrow staircase that spiraled down into the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something rancid. As he descended, the temperature dropped. His breath fogged in the dim light. The basement was larger than he remembered, its walls lined with old wooden shelves, filled with rusted tools and forgotten relics. But at the center of the room, beneath a flickering overhead bulb, something new had appeared. A chair. And on that chair sat the Scarecrow. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps. The figure was slumped forward, its burlap face stitched into a grotesque grin. The fabric of its arms was torn, revealing something beneath, something that wasn't straw. Bone. A sickening realization settled over him. The Scarecrow wasn't just a decoration. It was something more. Something real. Something buried. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around him like a windstorm. "You let me out." Daniel stumbled backward as the Scarecrow's head twitched. The shadows in the basement convulsed, shifting unnaturally. The air crackled with energy. Then the Scarecrow moved. Its limbs jerked violently, its head snapping upright. The stitched mouth tore open, releasing a guttural, inhuman wail. Daniel barely had time to react before the light above flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. He ran. Scrambling up the stairs, he could hear it behind him. Its movements unnatural, skittering, fast. The basement door slammed shut behind him just as he reached the top. He braced against it, his breath ragged, his mind screaming. Then, silence. The house was watching, waiting. A realization struck him then. The journal, the burial. The boy's body had been left in the attic, but that wasn't where the real entity had been imprisoned. It had been inside the Scarecrow, and now it was free. The night air had never felt so oppressive. Darkness wrapped around the farmhouse, like an unrelenting vice. pressing into every corner, seeping through the cracks in the wooden walls. Daniel sat rigidly in the center of the living room, his back against the couch, gripping the handle of a rusted axe he had found in the barn earlier that day. The message beneath his window had been a warning, a promise. Tonight, a low hum of static filled the air, though there was no radio turned on. The farmhouse seemed to breathe, its floorboards shifting under some unseen weight. Daniel's pulse pounded as he strained his ears for the sound he dreaded most, the footsteps. Then, they came. The porch creaked beneath a slow, deliberate pressure. A single step, then another. A shadow shifted just beyond the window. Daniel's grip on the axe tightened. He could feel the weight of something unnatural pressing against the thin walls of the house, testing them, probing for weakness. And then, a knock. Not frantic, not urgent. Just 3 slow, patient taps against the glass. Daniel swallowed hard, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. His fingers trembled as he reached for the flashlight beside him. He flicked it on and aimed the beam toward the window. Nothing. The knock came again, this time from the front door. He forced himself to his feet, legs shaking. He couldn't let this thing control him. He had to act, had to do something. Taking a deep breath, he moved toward the door, axe in one hand, flashlight in the other. He hesitated for only a moment before ripping the door open and swinging the flashlight's beam across the porch. The scarecrow stood inches from the doorway. It wasn't slouched as before. It stood rigid, its hollow, stitched eyes staring straight at him. Its body was contorted slightly, as though it had been caught mid-step. Daniel's mind screamed for him to slam the door, to run, to burn the whole damn house down. But something rooted him in place. The thing wasn't just standing there. It was waiting. Then, as if responding to his thoughts, the scarecrow twitched. A subtle, jerky movement, its head shifting a fraction to the left. A deep, guttural whisper rode the night air. "Let me in." Daniel let out a strangled yell, throwing his weight against the door and slamming it shut. He rammed the lock into place, then grabbed an old chair and wedged it under the handle. His breath came in sharp gasps as he stumbled backward. The knocking resumed, harder this time, more insistent. A sudden crash from upstairs sent his blood cold. Something, or someone, was inside the house. Daniel turned toward the staircase. The shadows at the top of the stairs writhed, shifting as though they had taken on a life of their own. His heart thundered against his ribs as he took a cautious step forward. Then, the attic door creaked open. The air grew impossibly heavy, thick with an oppressive force. The hallway light flickered and dimmed. A soft, scuffling sound echoed from above. Daniel raised the axe. A shape moved in the darkness. At first, it was barely visible, just a deeper shade of black in the unlit attic. Then, slowly, it stepped forward into the dim glow from the hallway bulb. A figure, small, frail. Its head hung at an unnatural angle, its limbs gaunt and elongated. The child in the photograph. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The boy's sunken eyes locked onto his, black as voids, lifeless and endless. A deep gash split his throat, old and rotting, like something long dead but never allowed to rest. The boy raised one hand and pointed toward the front door, and behind Daniel, the knocking stopped. A voice, barely above a whisper, slipped from the boy's lips. "He is waiting." Daniel turned slowly, his body refusing to obey the screaming terror in his mind. He reached for the doorknob with a trembling hand. As he twisted it open, the porch was empty. The scarecrow was gone, and in the darkness of the field, something moved. Daniel's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he stood in the doorway, his gaze locked onto the shifting darkness in the field. The wind had died completely, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. He could hear nothing. No rustling leaves, no insects, no sounds of the night. Just silence. Then, from the black void, a whisper slithered through the air. "It's time." Daniel stumbled back, slamming the door shut once more. His fingers fumbled to lock it, but deep down, he knew locks wouldn't keep this thing out. The axe in his hand suddenly felt small, useless against whatever was waiting for him outside. The boy in the attic had pointed toward the door. Had he been warning him, or leading him toward something inevitable? Daniel took a shaky breath and turned back toward the staircase. The attic door remained slightly ajar, its wooden frame groaning under the weight of the house's unseen force. The child was gone. A sound, slow, deliberate, drifted down from above. The sound of bare feet padding across the floorboards. Daniel tightened his grip on the axe and took a hesitant step forward. Each step up the staircase felt heavier than the last, as if something unseen was pressing against him, trying to hold him back. The attic doorway loomed ahead, a void of utter blackness. He lifted the flashlight, its trembling beam cutting through the thick shadows. The boy stood in the center of the attic. His mouth moved, but no sound emerged. His thin arm slowly lifted, pointing toward the floor. Daniel's gaze followed the gesture, his stomach nodding as he saw what lay there. A circle of charcoal, smeared symbols covering the wood, and at the center of it, something buried beneath the dust. A box. Daniel hesitated, but something deep within urged him forward. He crouched, fingers brushing against the brittle wood of the box's lid. It creaked as he lifted it, revealing a small bundle wrapped in decayed cloth. A wave of nausea rolled over him. Bones. Small, delicate bones. His fingers curled into fists as realization set in. The boy had never left. He had been buried here, forgotten, trapped. A slow, mournful whisper filled the attic, curling around Daniel's ears like a breeze from another time. "Free me." The farmhouse shuddered. A deep groan reverberated through the walls, and the air grew thick with the scent of rot and damp earth. The symbols on the floor began to glow faintly, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. The shadows coiled and twisted, forming into shapes. Faces, limbs, figures that flickered in and out of existence. The scarecrow was not the true source of this curse. It was merely the vessel. The real horror had been bound here, tied to the bones of the child, left to wither in the dark. Daniel's mind screamed for him to run, but he knew he had no choice. He had to end this. With shaking hands, he lifted the bundle of bones from the box. The moment he did, a deafening shriek erupted from the walls, the floor buckling beneath him. The attic swayed as though the house itself were alive, resisting him. Shadows lashed out, clawing at his arms and legs. He stumbled back toward the staircase, cradling the remains. The walls of the attic seemed to twist and stretch, elongating into an endless, suffocating tunnel. A blackened hand reached for him from the darkness, but he pushed forward, forcing himself to descend. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, the knocking returned. Harder this time, more violent. The entire front door rattled as if something massive was trying to break through. Daniel ran. He didn't stop until he was outside, his boots sinking into the cold, damp earth. The field stretched out before him, the scarecrow now visible in the moonlight. Its posture had changed again, its head tilted almost inquisitively, its arms stretched outward as if beckoning him closer. Daniel didn't hesitate. He ran toward it, the bones clutched tightly in his hands. The whispers swirled around him, the air charged with an electric hum. The closer he got to the scarecrow, the more distorted the world became. The sky darkened, the moon vanishing behind thick, swirling clouds. The ground trembled beneath his feet. As he reached the scarecrow, he fell to his knees. The earth was soft here, unnaturally so, as though something had been buried long ago. He began to dig. With frantic desperation, he clawed at the dirt, pulling it away in handfuls until the ground opened up beneath him, revealing a hollowed pit. The moment the bones touched the soil, the wind howled like a wounded animal. The scarecrow lurched violently, its limbs jerking as if pulled by invisible strings. Then, the thing spoke. You can't stop it. A voice, old and broken, barely more than a breath. Daniel watched in horror as the scarecrow convulsed, its burlap skin tearing open. From within, something writhed, struggling to escape. Blackened hands, too many to count, pushed against the inside of the sack-like body, tearing through the seams. The entity inside had been trapped, forced to feed on whatever it could reach, and now it was free. Daniel threw himself backward as a final, ear-piercing scream shattered the air. The scarecrow's form collapsed inward, its limbs folding unnaturally before it crumpled to the ground. The wind ceased. The air stilled. And then, silence. Daniel lay there, staring up at the sky, the moon emerging once more from behind the clouds. He felt empty, drained beyond reason. He had done it. He had freed the child, broken the curse, or so he thought. As he sat up, he noticed something in the distance. Beyond the field, just barely visible in the darkened horizon, a new scarecrow, standing perfectly still, watching. Daniel's entire body trembled as he knelt in the dirt, his fingers still buried in the cold soil where the bones had been laid to rest. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, but the silence that followed the scarecrow's collapse was heavier than anything he had ever known. Then, the wind stirred again, this time whispering through the field like a sigh of relief, or a warning. Daniel turned his gaze toward the horizon, and his stomach lurched. There, standing just beyond the broken remnants of the first scarecrow, was another one. Its frame was stiff, its hollow eyes locked onto him, just as the last had done before. But this one was different. Taller, leaner, and worse. It had moved. Daniel scrambled to his feet, his muscles screaming in protest. His mind raced. No, this can't be happening again. He had finished it. He had freed the child. The curse should have ended. So why was there another one? His hands clenched into fists as he forced himself to think. The farmhouse loomed behind him, its windows now dark, devoid of the presence that had filled them just moments ago. He could go back inside, barricade himself in. But what good would it do? The house had never been a refuge. It had been a cage. He needed to run. With a deep, shaky breath, Daniel sprinted toward his truck. His boots pounded against the dirt, his lungs burning as he pushed himself forward. The truck sat where he had left it, coated in a thin layer of dust. He wrenched the driver's side door open and slid inside, jamming the key into the ignition. Nothing. The engine didn't even sputter. It was dead. Daniel's throat tightened, as he slammed his fist against the wheel. Of course it wouldn't work. The thing, whatever it was, didn't want him to leave. It had trapped him here once, and it was doing it again. He turned his head back toward the field. The new scarecrow had moved closer. A choked gasp escaped his lips. No. I didn't see it move. It was further away. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to steady his breathing, then forced himself to look again. It was closer still. Daniel shoved the door open and stumbled out of the truck. His mind screamed at him to run, but where? The road leading out of the farm stretched into darkness, endless and empty. His legs felt leaden, his instincts warring between fight and flight. Then, the voice came. Soft at first, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "You let me out." Daniel turned sharply, scanning the darkness. The field was empty save for the scarecrow, standing there, waiting. "You let me out," the voice repeated. It came from everywhere and nowhere, curling around him like the wind, creeping into his ears like a dying breath. Daniel's pulse pounded. Who are you?" he choked out, his own voice barely above a whisper. No answer, only silence. Then the scarecrow moved, not in a slow, twitching way like before. This time, it lunged. Daniel let out a strangled cry as he stumbled backward. He barely kept his balance as he turned and ran toward the house, his legs carrying him faster than they ever had before. He reached the porch and yanked the door open, slamming it shut behind him. His breath came in heaving gasps as he pressed his back against the wood, as if his body alone could keep the horrors outside at bay. Silence. He strained to listen, ears aching for any sign of movement beyond the door. Then, a slow, steady knock. 3 times. Daniel's knees nearly buckled beneath him. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat, his mind screaming at him to do something, anything. But all he could do was stand there, frozen in terror. Another knock, then another. And then, the whisper again. "Let me in." Daniel shut his eyes tightly. It isn't real. It isn't real. He pressed his hands over his ears, willing the voice away. He just needed to think. He had to find a way out of this. His eyes snapped open as an idea struck him. The attic, the symbols, the bones. The scarecrow was a vessel, but what had been inside? If the child's remains had been cursed to hold something back, then burying them had set it free. His breath came in ragged gasps as he forced himself to move. He had to go back to the attic, find some way to reverse what he had done. His feet barely touched the stairs as he ran up them, heart pounding in his ears. The attic door was still ajar, a gaping maw leading into darkness. He hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. The air was thick, suffocating. The circle of charcoal was still there, but the glow was gone. The bones had been removed, the power undone. But there was something else in the room now. Something standing in the corner. Daniel's breath hitched. He barely had time to register the shape before it moved, stepping into the dim light. It was the boy. No longer translucent. No longer a ghostly whisper of the past. He stood there, fully formed, his hollow eyes locked onto Daniel's. His lips parted slightly, as if he was about to speak. Then he smiled. A sickening, unnatural grin stretched across his face. His head tilted, and his whisper came again. "You let me out." The attic door slammed shut, and the knocking downstairs started all over again. Daniel's breath came in short gasps as he pounded against the attic door, but it refused to budge. The wood was ice cold under his touch, as if the house itself was trying to swallow him whole. The knocking downstairs had stopped. Silence had settled over the farmhouse once more, thick and suffocating. The boy stood in the attic's dim glow, watching him with that eerie, unnatural smile. Daniel backed away slowly, pressing himself against the wall. "What do you want?" he rasped, his throat raw with fear. The boy tilted his head, considering the question, his black eyes reflecting nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he answered, "To go home." Daniel's heart pounded. "You were trapped here." The boy nodded. "And now I'm free." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows stretching, consuming everything. The symbols on the floor smudged and broken, their power lost. Then the boy took a step forward. Daniel flinched, expecting the worst, but the child simply walked past him. The attic door, which had been locked tight only moments ago, creaked open on its own. Daniel turned, watching in stunned silence as the boy descended the stairs. He followed, cautiously, his pulse a hammer against his ribs. When they reached the front door, it was ajar. The night outside was darker than before, a void that stretched endlessly. The boy stepped onto the porch and turned back toward Daniel. His hollow gaze met Daniel's one last time, and his lips parted in a whisper carried by the wind. "Thank you." Then, he was gone. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the last remnants of the boy's voice. The weight in the air lifted. The house exhaled. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, his limbs numb, his mind a hurricane of confusion. He had freed the spirit. But had he freed himself? A movement in the distance caught his eye. The field was empty. The scarecrow was gone. A sickening realization clawed at his gut. He turned back toward the house, stepping inside cautiously. It was different now, quieter, still. Then, just as he reached the staircase, he heard it. A knock. Not from the door, not from the walls, from the window. His breath caught in his throat as he turned slowly. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, but just behind him, barely visible in the darkened room, a figure, watching. If this world of mystery has captivated you, be sure to like and comment with the tales you'd love to hear next. Don't forget to subscribe and join me again in the quiet of the night for more journeys into the unknown.